Clarke's opinion of everyday humans being not only tools for use by others, but also inferior to machines, is expressed in the same interview. He stated, "I suspect that all really higher intelligences will be machines, unless they're beyond the machine, but biological intelligence is a lower form of intelligence, almost inevitably. We're in an early stage of evolution in intelligence, but a last stage in the evolution of life. Real intelligence won't be living." How utterly wrong Clarke was. As the snail's pace progress of artificial intelligence has revealed, the human brain is a hell of a lot more sophisticated than technocrats and programmers anticipated. Its inner workings are still largely a mystery. We can create machines that imitate and even far surpass specific limited human activities, but we're still not even a small fraction of the way to artificially reproducing the versatility of a human or human consciousness. A simpler way of putting this is that a hammer, while great for knocking nails into wood, is no substitute for the human hand. So why would Kubrick hire Clarke to write a severely distorted novelization of 2001? Well, it wasn't just about maintaining a long-lasting enigmatic order around the film. Equally important was the nature of the film's funding. Kubrick was at a turning point in his career. In his previous film, Dr. Strangelove, he'd firmly established himself as not only one of the greatest filmmakers alive, but he'd openly demonstrated his colossal ability to research complex psychological, scientific and political subjects and communicate them on film in a way that widely affected the public psyche. Kubrick and his film Dr. Strangelove were praised by those sick of Cold War paranoia, but yet viciously condemned by those whose interests it conflicted with. To make 2001, Kubrick needed massive funding and technical assistance, but he needed to do it in a way that his investors would not feel that they were funding a politically embarrassing film like Dr. Strangelove. At face value, and in all probability by Kubrick's chess-like deliberation, the story treatment of 2001 seemed like an ideal public relations opportunity for NASA and a variety of corporations. The US government were investing heavily in their plans for a man to walk on the moon as a demonstration of cultural and technological superiority to the Soviet Union. Kubrick's film project offer would serve as an effective public opinion primer in advance of the moon landings, to give the whole shebang a glorious, evolutionary milestone feeling. In his book about the making of 2001, Piers Bisney outlined the extent of corporate interest in the project. So here was a leading filmmaker offering an irresistible public relations opportunity. They knew Kubrick had the talent and technical expertise, but what they didn't know was that he was developing something unique in cinematic history, a double narrative. A film that has a simple alien contact narrative structure at face value, but which contains thousands of subliminal and encoded details that subconsciously pull the viewer in a different direction, and which, if the viewer is so inclined, transforms the film into a different story upon detailed examination. In the same way that Clarke was unaware he was writing a mismatching novelization, the script treatment shown to executives was an artificial cover story for the film Kubrick really wanted to make, a film that they would otherwise not have willingly funded. Also on page 38 of the aforementioned book, Clarke describes that at ComSat headquarters in Washington, he was introduced to Vice President Humphrey, who was also chairman of the Space Council, and told him we were spending $10 million to publicize space. And on page 269, he describes a planned 2.5-hour documentary about the moon landings, which he'd already written a treatment of for Time Life Corporation. Jay Cox also described a strong political presence at the film's world premiere. Something else that reinforced executive belief in the artificial surface narrative was the initial edit of the film. The executive screening cut included voiceover narration explaining the story in terms of contact with an alien race, and was preceded by interviews with real scientists about the possibilities of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. But Kubrick deleted all of this for the general release prints, thus leaving the film open to other interpretations, such as the possibility that the monolith might be God. The now narrationless film ceased to be space race propaganda and became a conceptual puzzle. Adding to the mystery was Kubrick's flat-out refusal to verbalize the film's deeper meanings for interviewers. Sometimes he would deflect questions by first refusing to answer, but then answering them with an oversimplified explanation. 1 minute implying the film was a sort of blank canvas for viewers to project their own ideas, and the next minute suggesting a sophisticated and deliberate form of visual communication. He told Jerome Agel, "I don't like to talk about 2001 too much because it's essentially a non-verbal experience. It attempts to communicate more to the subconscious and to the feelings than it does to the intellect. I think clearly there's a problem with people who are not paying attention with their eyes. They're listening, and they don't get much from listening to this film. Those who won't believe their eyes won't be able to appreciate this film." On another occasion he answered a question about 2001 by saying, "I don't really want to say what it is, but it's more of a mythological statement." When asked by Joseph Gelmus to elaborate on the surreal ending, Kubrick responded, "No, I don't mind discussing it, on the lowest level, that is, straightforward explanation of the plot. You begin with an artifact left on Earth 4 million years ago by extraterrestrial explorers who observed the behavior of the man-apes of the time and decided to influence their evolutionary progression. Then you have a second artifact buried deep on the lunar surface and programmed to signal word of man's first baby steps into the universe, a kind of cosmic burglar alarm. And finally there's a third artifact placed in orbit around Jupiter and waiting for the time when man has reached the outer rim of his own solar system. When the surviving astronaut Bowman ultimately reaches Jupiter, the artifact sweeps him into a force field or stargate that hurls him on a journey through inner and outer space, and finally transports him to another part of the galaxy, where he's placed in a human zoo approximating a hospital terrestrial environment, drawn out of his own dreams and imagination. In a timeless state, his life passes from middle age to senescence to death. He is reborn, an enhanced being, a star child, an angel, a Superman, if you like, and returns to Earth prepared for the next leap forward of man's evolutionary destiny." Note the Superman reference, which was paralleled by Kubrick's daughters jokingly calling Arthur C. Clarke, Clark Kent. Most likely they got the nickname from listening to their father. In the same interview, Kubrick immediately followed his plot explanation by stating, "That is what happens on the film's simplest level. Since an encounter with an advanced interstellar intelligence would be incomprehensible within our present earthbound frames of reference, reactions to it will have elements of philosophy and metaphysics that have nothing to do with the bare plot outline itself." Note Kubrick's insistence that the deeper meanings of the film are more complex than the surface narrative. The interviewer then asked Kubrick directly, "What are those areas of meaning?" And he replied, "They are the areas I prefer not to discuss because they are highly subjective and will differ from viewer to viewer. In this sense, the film becomes anything the viewer sees in it." Again, Kubrick falls back on the simplistic perceptual blank canvas explanation, despite already claiming that the deeper meanings are more complex than the surface plot. Some reviewers knew very well that Kubrick was weaving a cryptic smokescreen. For example, William Cloman of the New York Times preceded his interview by openly stating that Kubrick had left clues between the lines. And yet another statement by Kubrick suggesting a complex non-verbal underlying message is found in his interview with Jeremy Bernstein. Kubrick responds to a question about whether 2001 is as conceptually complex as the dialogue-driven concepts of Dr. Strangelove.
Have any of the pictures been as intellectually complicated as the present one? I mean, the 2001, and posed as many intellectual problems? I mean, it's a terrific undertaking, trying to create the future in a way.
Well, I don't know what intellectually complicated isn't really the right description for it, I don't think. I mean, Strangelove was a more intellectually complicated picture, and, you know, it involved complex arguments and quite a few, abstract ideas, clearly or comically stated. This is not as complex a picture. It's not as complicated a picture in terms of, ideas represented, ideas actually spoken,
This implies that 2001 is as complex as Doctor Strangelove, but in a non-verbal way. That doesn't really tally with the idea that the film is a perceptual blank canvas. And possibly of great importance, note Kubrick's amusement as he implies a complex non-verbal structure in 2001.
It's not as complicated a picture in terms of, ideas represented, ideas actually spoken,
Now before we start examining the non-verbal communication in 2001, I'd like to address an important issue. One of the difficulties with discussing 2001, or any film worthy of deep analysis, is that a lot of people are uncomfortable with non-verbal communication. They want films to be self-explanatory at the dialogue level, and to use only the most simple and non-taxing visual metaphors. When this demand of a film isn't met, they tend to insult the filmmaker rather than admit that they lack the motivation to pay attention to the film itself. This is true especially if they have a professional film critic's reputation and salary to protect. Kubrick knew this would be a problem. He told John Hofstede in 1976, "Very few critics ever see a film twice or write about films from a leisurely, thoughtful perspective. The reviews that distinguish most critics, unfortunately, are those slam-bang pans which are easy to write and fun to write and absolutely useless. There's not much in a critic showing off how clever he is at writing silly, supercilious gags about something he hates." He also stated, "Words are a terrible straitjacket. It's interesting how many prisoners of that straitjacket resent its being loosened or taken off." And so we find that reviews of 2001 frequently include frustrated condemnation from supposedly professional film critics, whose reviews can be easily bettered by movie discussions in your local bar. For example, Pauline Kael, who may as well have sat blindfolded through 2001. Her hostile and bitter review was so lacking in even the most basic understanding or even curiosity that another critic, Tony Macklin, remarked on her stellar arrogance and questionable ability of perception. This resistance to unfamiliar forms of dialogue-free communication extends even to some of the crew who worked on the film. For example, technical advisor Frederick Ordway wrote an extensive breakdown of what he didn't like about the film. His primary and repeated gripe being Kubrick's removal of plot-defining narration. Even working with Kubrick and seeing firsthand the director's widely documented involvement with every aesthetic detail of his films wasn't enough for Ordway to realize the complexity and precision of 2001's non-verbal structure, a factor that is severely lacking in most script-orientated feature films. Kubrick summarizes, "The screenplay form is about the least ideal way of communicating information, especially if it's visual or emotional." Unfortunately for many viewers, 2001 A Space Odyssey will never mean anything more than the words spoken by its characters or the text written in the novel. They will avoid thinking outside a world defined only in words, despite unconsciously responding every day to complex symbols and metaphors in the realms of body language, entertainment, art, humour, fashion and advertising. If that statement meets with your disapproval, then you're most likely one of those people and are unlikely to enjoy the rest of this video. But for everyone else, let's move on.